Welcome to The Plunge with Derek Holzer. Librarian Derek here today, encouraging you to continue to utilize the tremendous benefit that you have of being literate. You know, literacy has not always been a common thing in civilization. And so I want to encourage you that while there may be some, murmurings and grumblings that people are reading less and less, books continue to proliferate. And there are many great books out there today, and of course throughout the ages past. My guest today, Nate Hile, likely has his own special spot at his local library. Such a voracious reader he is. A very witty, deeply philosophical, keenly insightful man. Nate Hile runs the Grail Country channel on YouTube, a popular repository of many deep metaphysical, philosophical, esoteric, spiritual, theological conversations. I thank you for joining us, and I'm grateful to Nate for being willing to take the plunge. Let's dive in. All right. I am so thankful to have Nate Hile with me, a fellow Washingtonian. I think this is my first plunge guest who resides in the same state as me. So Nate, welcome.
Yeah, we should have got together over a beer.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we'll get to do this again in person. I've always appreciated the work that you've done with Grail Country. I'm a newcomer to your channel and your content, but really meaningful, and I appreciate you joining me to talk about Owen Barfield. But before we get into that, would you be willing to share a little bit about your own backstory and what wonders and curiosities stir you in life?
Okay, sure. So I'm a native Washingtonian. I come from a little town closer to the coast that is, well, more people know of the town and have heard of it than might normally be the case because of a little band called Nirvana that came from the same town. I'm from Aberdeen. So, yeah, I grew up in Aberdeen. We moved around a bit when I was a kid, but we always ended up coming back to Aberdeen. But I spent some time when I was really young, I was in Longview, Kelso area, and then Yakima, but always ended up coming back to Aberdeen. So most of my growing up was from Aberdeen. I graduated from Aberdeen High School in 1989. I went to Evergreen.
Were you classmates with Kurt Cobain?
No, I'm younger. Kurt was a few years ahead of me. I was class of '89. I think Kurt graduated in '86. I want to say.
Pretty close.
Yeah. So yeah. I had people that I played. I actually had a guy who I played D&D with in Aberdeen who was in the same graduating class as Kurt. I mean, almost everybody from Aberdeen has like some kind of like. I also had like one of my ex-girlfriends, like her sister used to date Kurt. I mean, it's so especially when my generation, right? I'm Gen X, so yeah, there's a lot of people that have connection one way or another. Now, a guy that I graduated with actually wrote a fairly major biography of Kurt. And he actually, it must have been, I can't remember if it was junior or senior, but I remember one time he came into the lunchroom and there was a bunch of us, I think it was mostly debaters that were like talking together over lunch, sitting on these couches. And he comes in and he's like talking to us about Nirvana and how great Nirvana is and how they're going to be bigger than Red Hot Chili Peppers. And we all thought he was insane. Yeah. So that's cool. That's the place I come from. I went to Evergreen right out of high school. I ended up transferring to Thomas Aquinas College in Santa Paula, California, which is a great books college. The reason I went to Evergreen initially is because the year I was entering Evergreen, they actually offered a great books program. So it's like I knew I wanted to study great books.
Okay.
And so because Evergreen was offering a great books program, I'm just like, well, Evergreen is really close to home. I'm still getting a chance to study great books. So I took the great books program at Evergreen, and then I transferred to Thomas Aquinas. And then, like stuff in life happened. I moved to Nevada for a while, came back, finished up my degree at Evergreen. So, yeah. In terms of what interests me, I mean, my channel is called Grail Country. So it's probably not too surprising to learn that I have an interest in Arthurian legend and the Grail. In general, I have an interest in romanticism. I think it's kind of important for Barfield to books he wrote is Romanticism Come of Age. So Barfield also saw the importance that the Romantics were trying, like they had an intuition of something, they were moving towards something, but they didn't. It wasn't quite mature, it wasn't quite ready, and there were parts that were missing. So yeah, I'm kind of like this modern romantic neo-medievalist from near the coast of Washington State, and I like things that are old and weird.
Yeah. You sound like my kind of guy. Are you an honorary member of the Knights Templar? Do you have any paraphernalia along those lines?
No, I don't secretly belong to any knightly orders. Although I do call myself a Grail Knight on Twitter because of the Grail Country thing.
Well, let me ask you then before
Wait a minute, unexpected thing. The other thing it says in my Twitter bio is it says Grail Knight and Sooner Faithful. So the reason a guy from the coast of Washington State is a big Oklahoma Sooners fan is that for a large chunk of my childhood, I was raised by my grandparents. And my grandfather was from Oklahoma City, and him and his brothers were all big Sooners fans, and so I grew up watching Oklahoma football. And I went to colleges that had no football team, so I just stayed a Sooners fan my whole life.
That's great. Well, keep with it. I grew up in Kentucky, and so I've been a Wildcat fan. Not as good at football as the Sooners, that's for sure.
No, but I remember. Do you remember Jared Lorenzen though?
Yeah.
See, I was
lefty.
See, yeah, I was a fat athletic kid with a good arm, so I loved Jared. He was my boy.
Yeah. Rest in peace. I wanted to ask you before Barfield, just because of the Arthurian legend, do you think that it's true?
Do I think that it's true? Well, this is interesting. That's a really great question. I think it is true, but not necessarily in the way that people might assume. Like, I'm not necessarily big into the whole search for historical Arthur thing. Not so much into that. But I think Henri Corbin said that he talked about the Grail and he compared it to the Shia stories of the hidden Imam. Okay. And what he said is that they were both intuitions of the same divine realities, right? So it's actually, you don't need to believe that there was any influence. It's just that you have these stories that have this similar pattern because they're both people seeing the same underlying divine realities that are normally hidden from us because they've learned how to see. So, and I think that actually connects to Barfield.
I was going to say, I think there's something there.
Yeah.
So tell me how you first heard of Owen Barfield.
Okay, so this is an interesting thing. So I'm going to go back. I'm going to tell you a little bit more of my backstory in order to explain this. So as a youngster, like, my imagination was formed by the Inklings. My mother read to me from the Chronicles of Narnia. I read the first books that I read that were not like beginner reading books, like the first like actual books that I read when I was probably 6 or 7 years old, where I read the Chronicles of Narnia on my own. Before that, my mother had read them to me. She read to me the stories of George MacDonald, who was obviously a profound influence on really all of the Inklings, and she read to me The Hobbit, Tolkien's The Hobbit, and then I read Tolkien later on my own. So I'd always been I'd been reading the Inklings like literally my whole life. Like I have no memory of a time when the work of the Inklings was not part of my life. But I'd never heard of Owen Barfield until 2015. I think it's 2015. The book that introduced me to Barfield was Mark Vernon's book, The Secret History of Christianity. And I read Mark's book and I was like, okay, how have I not known about this guy for all these years? And so then I do when I get an interest in something, I pursue it with a lot of gusto. And so I started reading all of the Barfield I could get my hands on. And I first started finding whatever essays I could find online. I kind of looked at advice as to what was the best introductory book to begin with. I started with Poetic Diction rather than diving right into Saving the Appearances. And then after I had read Saving the Appearances and Poetic Diction, it kind of started on my Barfield dive. Actually, I saw Michael DeFuscia, who kind of inspired your series. I saw a conversation that Michael had with a guy who's not a friend of mine named Michael Lighty. And I made a bunch of comments on that video when Paul Vanderklay rebroadcast it on his channel.
Okay.
the conversation between Michael and Michael and Michael,
Yeah.
Michael and Mike.
Yeah.
Right? And I made a bunch of comments, and Michael Lighty thought that they were really insightful, and so he wanted to get a hold of me and talk to me, and so we ended up forming a relationship, having a conversation, and he's the one who insisted that I start Grail Country. It was his idea.
Wow.
Yeah. So there's a direct link between Barfield and actually Dr. DeFucia are involved in the story of how I really started to take Barfield more seriously and why I started the Grail Country project.
That's fantastic. Well, our paths have crossed then in that way, because I had a few interactions with Michael Laity in a small guys group online for a period during COVID, again through Michael DeFucia. But it's Michael DeFucia's friendship that first began for me in person. We lived in the same area in 2018 that led me to discover Barfields. We're full circle here.
And I read Michael's book immediately after seeing that video. So I've read Michael's book. It's good.
Hey.
Yeah.
He'll say you're among the dozens.
I actually read it was actually his recommendation from that conversation that kind of got me into. So one of the other areas where I've done a lot of reading is amongst the radical orthodoxy school of thinkers within the mostly Anglican theological world. And he had recommended a book by Adrian Paps. So that was the first book I read from the radical orthodoxy folks. So, yeah.
Fascinating. Well, let me ask you then, what was your first impression with Barfield? Especially coming to him later in life, perhaps. You've got a lot of other ideas that have matured and developed.
Yeah, I wasn't one of those people that Barfield was a hard sell for, and I'm trying to put my finger on it, and I think in my early 20s, I went through a period where I took poetry very seriously, right? And so I had written a lot of poetry, and I entered Barfield through Poetic Diction, and because of my experience in writing poetry, I kind of got him pretty quickly, because one of the first important things I learned in writing poetry after some of my early poems were eviscerated by an instructor was that poetry is rooted in the image, and this idea, this importance of the image, is very important to understanding what Barfield is. And that's why he looks to poetry as kind of like a route of kind of restoring more of a wholeness to the way that we think and look about the world, because it's the poetic imagination that is able to see reality as whole. What Barfield's really all about is about breaking down dualities, right?
Yeah.
The duality of spirit and matter, the duality that divides our own thinking, which is, and we've understood that duality is a problem for a long time, but that's kind of what the narrative of the fall is about, right?
Right.
It's a story about this fall into ego consciousness that has a lot of positives that come along with it, but it also causes us to be divided against ourselves.
Yeah.
And not in harmony with the rest of creation. So.
Yeah, and perhaps, I don't know if, I'm not attempting to correct you, but the word that comes to my mind is fractured.
Yeah.
Because that word connotes brokenness in a way that divided doesn't.
Right, yeah. No, definitely. It's the idea that it's fractured. Tomberg, who I'll probably bring up quite a bit in this conversation, because I think that'll kind of be my unique, because you're talking to several people. I think my contribution here is going to be kind of linking together the connection between Barfield and Tomberg, because they're both part of a general stream of thought that's evolution of consciousness thinking. And so the connection between Barfield and Tomberg is that Tomberg was a student of Steiner's originally, and he broke with Steiner because he ended up converting to Catholicism, and so he wanted to move the same kind of thought in a direction that was more compatible with Orthodox Christianity, specifically with traditional Roman Catholicism. So this is why he broke with Steiner. Now Steiner definitely is not, he's certainly not anti-Christian, and he talks about Christ a lot, but he
Right.
says some things that are like definitely unorthodox and strange. And so Tomberg kind of like takes some of those things and he moves them into a more orthodox, friendly direction. But he still has a bunch of insight into other wisdom traditions, other faiths. But he shows the way in which those ultimately are less full and complete a revelation. So he's more explicitly Christian in what he does than Steiner is. So
Sure.
while still being very esoteric. I mean, he's a very esoteric writer, but he's esoteric in a more explicitly Christian way. And so Tomberg has kind of become a special interest of mine. And I would never have discovered Tomberg without Barfield. But the point is that the reason I brought him up was because, yes, you're precisely right to talk about it in terms of fracture and brokenness, and that's why we have this narrative of the fall and perdition.
Sure.
And he actually cautions against we can't just see it as only a natural process of spiritual evolution. We cannot lose the sense of fall and perdition, because those reveal to us like deeper layers of the nature of the situation that we're in, as if we just look at it as an unfortunate accident of nature, because it's a denial of the amount of agency we actually have in this. And I think Barfield sees that we have agency in this too. He hints in several times that there's more of agency in our perceptions than we want to acknowledge, right? So it's not like perception is not entirely passive. So there is there is agency in having eyes to see and ears to hear.
Right. Sure.
Right? It's
By
not just
virtue of- yeah.
you either do or you don't.
Right. Right. Yeah. Inherent in the form is the function, right?
Yeah.
Well, I'd love to kind of dive into what you're mentioning there with Tomberg, and in particular, maybe I want to sort of elucidate one of the things you mentioned to me when we first discussed doing this series. You said you'd like to discuss the connection between the problem of the closed world, as described by Tomberg in his Meditation on the Wheel, and the schizophrenia of our one-eyed vision. So I guess before answering the question of what is the problem of the closed world, I would like to know a little bit more in terms of Tomberg, station, place and time.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So Valentin Tomberg was born in Russia.
Okay.
And he was a Russian monarchist who fought in the White Army and immigrated after the revolution. And he was a mystic and an esotericist who was a follower of Rudolf Steiner. And then somewhere, I think while he was living in England, he eventually ended up becoming a Catholic. So he converted to Catholicism, and he began to, he still had all the insight that he got from anthroposophy, but he took his anthroposophical insights and he kind of baptized them and brought them into communication with the truths that the Catholic Church has always held, and demonstrates the way in which they line up with principles that the church has always taught. He makes this move in his most well-known and major work. The work is called Meditations on the Tarot. He wrote it anonymously. He did not take credit for it in his lifetime. It was written in French. The English translation was done by a man named Robert Powell. The English translation appeared in 1985. The German edition had an afterword that was written by Hans-Urs von Balthasar, the cardinal.
Interesting.
It actually it's been photographed on the desk of popes.
Okay.
So
wow.
So yeah, it's an interesting work. The title is kind of misleading, right? Because it's called Meditations on the Tarot, and Tomberg has this background in esotericism, and the subtitle is An Exploration in Christian Hermeticism. But it's really what he's doing is actually kind of like, you know what Jonathan Pageau does over at the Symbolic World?
Yes.
Well, Tomberg was doing this in mid-century.
Okay.
It's a work on symbolism, and specifically, it's a work that focuses on the symbolism that one finds in the tarot deck.
Interesting.
And the symbols that one finds in the tarot deck are still like deeply connected to the older symbolic order before we kind of like lost it in modernity.
Uh-huh.
And he really just takes a phenomenological approach. He just is like, oftentimes he'll start off a letter just examining the phenomenology of the card. And then, okay, what is this phenomenology, this symbolism that we see here? What does it suggest? That's why it's a meditation, right? So it's a meditation. It has nothing to do with divination or anything like that.
Okay.
It's just a work of symbolism.
Fascinating. So I really appreciate that because I'm unfamiliar with his work, and clearly he had quite an influence. What is the problem of the closed world?
Okay, so in letter 10 of the Meditations on the Tarot is the letter he writes about the wheel. Okay? And so when he's talking about the wheel, he talks about how the wheel represents the kind of the same idea as what you see in the image of the Ouroboros. And he relates this myth where it's kind of like he's drawing on the image of the Ouroboros where you have a serpent that is inserting its tail into its mouth.
Mm-hmm.
And he tells this story of how, like, after God is finished with the creation and rest from the creation, and we have the 6 days of creation followed by the Sabbath, that the world at that time is still open to God. There's that the world is a world that has room for Sabbath. And he compares this structurally to, rather than being a closed circle, he compares it to a spiral. And actually to the opening step of a spiral, which promises infinite progress.
Right.
So, zap, right. And so the serpent says to the human beings that as long as the world is open to God, there's no freedom in the world. And so I can teach you how to be free like I am. And so then he puts this tail into his mouth and he creates this closed circle, and then he spins in rapid movement. And so he says that this symbolizes the wheel of eternal return, where nothing new ever happens. Like, this is what in Ecclesiastes, right? Like, vanity, vanity, all is vanity. And this is, but that world,
Groundhog Day.
right? But that isn't the real world. That's not the world that was created by the Father. That's not the world that was open to Sabbath. So he says that the woman. Then he contrasts, like as in Genesis, right? He contrasts the symbolism of the woman to the symbolism of the serpent, and he says that the children of the woman kept alive the memory of the world of the Sabbath. And then he gets to then he gets to the verse about that her heel will crush your head. So he's kind of like he's showing you that, like, essentially that the symbolic, like the woman is kind of symbolic of like the original, like, soul of the world immediately after creation before the fall, and retains that memory, whereas the serpent is representative of the fallen world, which is effectively a prison. But it's a prison, but as you pointed out, it's a prison that is because of fracture. It's because of our own agency is involved. We followed the example of the serpent, which is how we ended up in this closed world. So then the question is like, well, how do we escape? And then he talks about how, like, some, like, the religions of the East, for example, it's not only Christianity that has an intuition of the fact that we live in this closed world, right? Other religions have seen this too. But he gives, for example, like Buddhism. Buddhism teaches you techniques so that you can escape from the closed world yourself and taste Sabbath, right?
Right.
And have rest from. But what Christianity, through the incarnation and the resurrection, promises not merely escape from the closed world, but the transformation of the closed world from within back into the open world, where there is room for Sabbath and the world and God can really be related to the world again, and that relationship, that fractured relationship, is restored.
Yeah.
And he says that comes through he's explicitly Christian and Catholic about it. So he's like, this comes through. This is the birth of the Word, of the incarnate word. So he uses this, and he's weaves scripture throughout the entire analogy. So he's talking about a closed world. Well, Barfield, in a few places, like actually, I just reread Force of Habit from the book Guilt, Habit, and History. Yeah.
Yeah.
And he talks about it in terms of a prison there. And you can see, like, the idea of a closed world and the idea of a prison. In fact, Tomberg calls it, he says the closed world is a prison. So it's like, they're both recognizing that the world that we are in now, in our mode of consciousness, and it is our very mode of consciousness that is what creates this prison, right?
Right.
It's not like an evil God that is God. No, it's us. It's our fault, right? It falls on us. So we've locked ourselves in this prison through the misuse of our own agency, and that. The problem is that most of the tools that we use to break out of this prison actually are just end up being things to pass the time in prison, because we actually are still stuck within the prison frame, right?
Right.
So he says like all of our politics, extreme left, extreme right, all of our philosophy, it's just all of it just ends up just being ways to pass the time while we're in prison because we don't ever break through the walls. And he points toward Barfield's method of escaping from the prison is a study of our own history of consciousness through a close study of words and through poetry, which engages the poetic imagination, which is Barfield's, and he says it's not the only, but that's Barfield's preferred mechanism of overcoming the prison and learning to see the world with new eyes. Now, and he also describes this condition as one-eyed, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
In Poetic Diction, he evokes the image of Odin hanging on the world tree, sacrificing an eye for the secret of the runes, and he compares that to our condition, because this is kind of what we've done in order to gain this power that we have through the scientific revolution. Well, yes, we gained all this power, but we now see the world one-eyed. Let me actually have a quote from Tomberg about. Tomberg says something that is remarkably similar, so I want you to see the parallel here. Here we go. This is, let me just pull this at eye level. Okay, so this is what Tomberg says. He says, doubt. It is the principle of division and opposition, and therefore of illness. For just as intellectual doubt divides the intellect by confronting it with two contrary tableaus and reduces it to impotence of indecision, so is bodily illness a doubt in the organism, i.e. two tendencies opposed to one another, reducing it to impotence and constraining it to remain in bed. Doubt is to faith, as the sight of eyes suffering from astigmatism is to normal eyesight. Just as normal eyes do not see or see together, so does faith see, whether more or less is not important, with the higher eye and the lower eye together. For certainty is due to the coordinated vision of the higher or the transcendent self, this is the higher eye, and the lower empirical self, which is the lower eye. Doubt appears when the higher eye and the lower eye do not see together. There is then a spiritual astigmatism, a lack of coordination between the two seers of man. Doubt is a beast with two horns, since it only bifurcates. However, doubt that is mastered under the control of the will and put into its service proves to be prodigiously useful. This is the Odin bargain now, right?
Yeah.
As the whole history of science shows, there doubt is utilized as an instrument of scientific faith, where one doubts within the precise limits of the scientific method, being guided by it and in the interest of scientific faith. If Pasteur had not doubted the spontaneous generation on the one hand, and if he had not had a faith in observation and experimentation on the other hand, we would not now benefit from the fruits of the Pastorian revolution in biology and medicine.
Sure.
Okay, so he then says, productive though it is in the scientific domain, so this is where the cost comes in, right? Yeah. Productive though it is in the scientific domain, doubt nevertheless entails expenses that must be paid. You got to give up an eye. Its practice, be it only by using it as a method, results in a partial blindness. It renders us one-eyed. For the fact of regularly turning away from the higher eye, from its message and testimony, and confining oneself to the lower eye, which is what we do in science, right? We only pay attention to the lower things, cannot fail sooner or later to have its effect, i.e. to render one-eyed he who assiduously practices the use of one eye instead of two. And then he goes on to point out that, here's the thing, and this lines up with Barfield's idea of final participation too. So it's like, so Tomberg's answer isn't like, okay, well, let's go back to some earlier time period when we saw with the higher eye. Well, he said, here's the problem: the scientific revolution and our ability to focus and learn on what this lower eye can give us has yielded positive things, all of which we discard. And he points out how in the Middle Ages, like all the theologians and mystics of the Middle Ages, they never gave us any of those things, right?
Right.
So they had a one-eyed vision too. But they were looking with the higher eye alone. So this is why Barfield says that the idea is not to go back to original participation, which in Saving the Appearances, by the way, he actually says that original participation simply is paganism, right? So the idea isn't to go back to original participation. The idea is to make the most of this consciousness that we've developed and move into final participation, and that is to restore a two-eyed vision.
Yeah.
And Barfield talks about this in terms of causing a cultural schizophrenia, which is exactly the same language that Ian McGilchrist uses these when he talks about what's happened. He talks about it in terms of brain hemispheres, right? And he talks about that we've become like a culture that's dominated by the things that are the strengths of the left brain and neglected the strengths of the right brain. I think Barfield would accuse McGilchrist of residual unresolved positivism was the term that he would use, which he also accused Chardin of too, because he wouldn't have liked him putting it in terms of, because Julian James wrote a book that was about the development of the bicameral mind in the mid-70s, which Barfield also looked at favorably. But again, he didn't. The fact that he brought it down to like brain biology was not. Barfield couldn't go there. So I think Barfield would have the same problem with McGilchrist's work. But the observation that there's something about our culture that is broken and fractured and making us crazy because of its lopsidedness in one direction is still like Barfield would have definitely got behind that.
Well, there's a couple of thoughts that come to mind. Thank you very much for that. The first, I think, probably with respect to the incomplete vision or the self-restricted vision of the one eye or the closed world, I think of, with respect to Barfield's commentary on final participation, is there a correlation to the letters of Paul talking about now we see through a glass darkly, but then we will see face to face? Not necessarily that Paul was thinking in terms of evolution of human consciousness, but...
No, I think Barfield's definitely... Barfield's talking about the parousia without using religious terms.
Yeah.
That's what he's telling you. That's what he's talking about the parousia when he's talking about final participation. That's why it's final.
Right.
So yeah, that is, and but what he wants people to see. So it's still a challenge though, right? Because Barfield is letting you see that this is like we have agency, right? So in order for the parousia to happen, the bride has to say, "Even so, come."
Right.
Right. So Barfield is saying is restoring to us a sense of like. No, God wants to save us, but it's not just a divine rescue mission. We have a part to play too.
Right.
We have to want to be saved. We have to learn to transform our vision. And also the other thing, Barfield is very clear that this is like not a. I don't want to make this sound. This is like an individual bootstrap kind of a thing. This is not. This is our collective problem because this isn't about how I see things or you see things or my neighbor sees things.
Right.
There's a way in which it's like we're all caught in the same trap. We're all in the same trap together. And so, but Barfield says that the way out of the trap is for individual people to be able to learn to tunnel under the walls of the prison and set an example for others.
That makes sense. Following on from that, with respect to Barfield's approach, and I had, I think, a productive conversation with Max Leaf-Trinan on this, which is part of this series, but I'm thinking of actions and practices may be the better word, for how one goes about this undertaking and connecting it to what you referenced earlier about the left and right hemisphere and the unity of, I guess, whether it be valuation, I'm not sure the right word, with respect to how we reinforce a culture, transform a culture that provides equal validity to the pursuits of the whole person as opposed to this singular component.
Yeah, I would say, well, first of all, I would say liturgies are important. Right? Liturgies are important because liturgies are embodied actions that give us insight of things that we may not be able to imagine, but somehow the practice of doing liturgies actually help. It actually brings us into a pattern. Like, I think liturgies are inherently participatory, right? Participation is a big concept for Barfield. So it the way we know liturgically knowing things is always participatory. It's you learn by engaging with it, and there's also like the liturgy, if you're doing it right, there's interpenetration, right? So it's not like it's just like it helps to make so the world is is less full of dead objects. So I think liturgy is important, and I think poetry is important. I agree with Barfield that poetry is important, and you can see the way in which, like, reading really great poetry, you can see the way in which you can see it in a great poem, because like we have this sense of epiphany.
Yes. When
we read a great poem, right?
Yes.
And one of the things that will consistently cause that epiphany is that great poetry, it kind of erases the line between observed and observer. Like, one of the things I've said in the past is that like a poetic vocation is a form of is kind of a deep form of witness, because what the poet is doing is they're trying to use the image in order to show you reality.
Mm-hmm.
And the reality that you see in a great poem is not a world that is merely a world of things. Like a poetry that was merely that merely portrayed things would have no impact. It would seem inhuman.
Yes.
So
yeah. It's actually revelatory in that way. Interesting. And as you mentioned, liturgy, I think not only is it participatory, but quite often it's communal.
Correct.
So
yes.
Is there anything further you'd like to address with respect to his work in Poetic Diction?
I think the reason I brought up Poetic Diction is because I definitely wanted to talk about the one-eyed vision, because there was that parallel that I wanted to bring out in Tomberg. But the other important thing that you're going to get out of Poetic Diction is you're going to realize that all of our language is metaphor, right? So Brett Weinstein has his idea of like metaphorical truth, and it's like, Brett, there's no other kind, because our language is built up of metaphors. And the more you study the history of a word, you realize that it's made up of metaphors.
Yeah.
Right. So
a vision comes to my mind of like just an infinite cube, like stacks and stacks of layers, essentially tracing back to origin, I suppose. And then what is origin? I'm not sure. How would you say you espouse Barfield's worldview? To what extent do you or don't?
Yeah, I do. I think you'll actually, when you go through the Grail Country catalog, first of all, I don't think there's no matter what, Barfield seems to come up no matter what we're discussing. And obviously a lot of the content we do is it's kind of downstream from Barfield. Right? So I know one of the early series that we did was on a book. It was a book written by Emil Bock, who was another student of Steiner's. And he wrote a book on the Apocalypse of John. Well, why did I study that book? I studied that book because I found an old book review that Owen Barfield had written about it.
About the Apocalypse of John?
About the Apocalypse of John by Emil Bock. And he's like, hey, anyone who thinks that the apocalypse isn't important and that it's difficult to understand, it can't be understood, needs to read this book. And that Emil Bock's book just brings the symbols of the apocalypse to life. And so it's like, well, that sounds like, especially for somebody who grew up Pentecostal, right? And it's like, okay. So it's like, okay. And
don't get left behind, Nate.
Yeah, right. So I there was no way I wasn't going to be interested in reading that book. So I read it, and it's just fantastic. I actually just sent Jordan Hall a copy.
Okay.
He's reading it, and he actually told me before our last conversation. He told me that not only is he reading it, but that his wife picked it up, and she was in the middle of taking a course on the Apocalypse of John when she picked up Emil Bock's book.
Interesting.
And she said to Jordan, she said that they should just scrap the course that she's been taking and start it over using Bock's text as the course guide. So no, yeah. So we did the entire. We covered that entire book, which is downstream from Barfield. It's a student of Steiner. He's an evolution of consciousness thinker too, and he's doing an interpretation of the Apocalypse of John. And so we did that.
I'm pulling it up now, actually, as you continue to talk, because I'll need to read that along
and then, of course, I think one of the things my channel is best known for is that we did a really long series on Tomberg's Meditations on the Tarot.
Okay.
Which is I think we did 25 episodes. It's 22 letters, but some letters were so dense we had to do more than one episode. Mm-hmm. So I think it's 25 episodes in total. And that was I invited my friend Dr. Michael Barton on for that series because he taught the book before and had a very good knowledge of the work. And that was when I did that series, that was my first encounter. I was reading those letters for the first time every episode.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And by the way, that is for if anyone wants to pick up that book and read it, I do recommend reading it. They're called meditations, so I really do recommend picking up one letter at a time, spending time with a letter, and not trying to rush through it. And that seemed to be I still quote from it all the time now because I really retained it by doing it that way. So I'd recommend it. But that also is that's down. It's still downstream, right? Because Tomberg again is he's an evolution of consciousness thinker. He comes out of Steiner world. Tomberg was appealing to me because I'm Anglican, but I lean toward the Anglo-Catholic side of my tradition. So I was kind of sympathetic to his Catholicism. I love symbolism. I joke sometimes. It's funny. I'll tell you a funny story about the first time my son saw Jonathan Pajot
on
YouTube. He comes to me. I think he saw Pajot before I did, and so I all the time around our little corner of the internet, people talk about how hard Pajot is to understand, and for me, it's he was speaking my native language because my route back toward Christianity looks more like Martin Shaw's than basically anybody else because I was what I was into was mythology and folklore and that kind of thing. So I wasn't so that's the stuff that I get. So the kind of symbolic languages, and also I went to Thomas Aquinas College and it's I've read every dialogue of Plato. So it's if you're talking symbolism and Platonism, that's my native tongue and I'm going to understand you. So my son sees a Pajot, the first Pajot video he sees is the Santa Claus Exists video. And he comes to me and he says, "Dad, you've got to see this guy." He said he's doing a video. He's it's the same speech that you gave me when I was 6 about Santa Claus. And it was the contents of Pajot's video were almost word for word, almost exactly the same kinds of things that I'd said to my son when he was 6 years old. And so, yeah.
That's amazing. Well,
so I joke that I'm the trailer park version of Pajot because I'm kind of a redneck from Aberdeen. So.
Well, more of that. I'm a redneck from Kentucky, so we can hang out. One of the things on that point, nothing connected to Barfield, but maybe with symbolism and image, it strikes me county fairs, no matter what state you're in, look the same. So
yeah.
Anyway.
What part of Kentucky are you from, by the way?
I grew up in Louisville, so
okay.
The main city there, but had plenty of exposure to Southern culture, for sure.
Gotcha. I was just going to ask you if you've ever had the barbecued mutton.
Barbecued mutton?
Yeah.
No, I never did.
Yeah, it's the other part of the state. I think it's in eastern Kentucky. So eastern Kentucky they have this very unusual barbecue tradition where their thing is mutton. It's actually it's a very large Welsh population.
Yes, in Appalachia.
Right? Yeah, exactly. So it's a lot of ethnically Welsh, and there are a lot of people that raise sheep.
Yeah.
And so mutton is what they had. So they cook barbecue in a traditional barbecue style, but rather than beef or pork, it's mutton, and the barbecue sauce they use is black barbecue sauce. It's like heavy on the Worcestershire.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Interesting.
I'm a
Well,
barbecue guy. That's why I asked.
okay. Well, before we turn for home with Barfield, what's the top barbecue region or style in your taste?
You know, my son, I had a discussion with this soon. Here in Washington, it seems like Central Texas style is the most popular, right? Like most every new barbecue joint that pops up is Central Texas style. When I used to cater barbecue,
Okay.
and I actually specialize in cooking whole hogs.
Yeah.
So Carolina style.
Yes, in
So
the
I
pit.
really love whole hog barbecue.
Yeah.
But if you really hold a gun to my head and say, oh, there's only one barbecue item you can have for the rest of your life, I'm gonna choose ribs.
Okay.
Ribs are where that's where the bacon is, man.
Well, that's great. Well, you mentioned the Carolina style. I believe that's the pit, long, slow cook, right?
Yeah, what I would do when I was catering is that I would cook it in a cinder block pit and then
Yeah.
transfer. Then I had a tow behind offset that I would use to transfer it to site. But
Yeah.
I would do the cooking in a traditional cinder block pit.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
in high school, one of my jobs was at a restaurant, if you're ever in Louisville, Mark's Feed Store, and it was the cinder block pits in the back half of the restaurant, and the night before we would foil up the big slab and put it on there, hickory smoke all night long, 13, 14 hours cooking.
My
That stuff.
granny was from Huntsville, Alabama, and her first job was in a barbecue restaurant in Huntsville, and she used to tell me stories about their mysterious pitmaster at the place in Huntsville where she worked. He was an older African American guy who he wouldn't tell anybody any of his secrets, and like this kind of your standard like pitmaster personality. But she always talked fondly, like she really liked that job. And they always my grandparents. My grandfather's from Oklahoma, which is also part of the barbecue belt. Oklahoma turns out some pretty good barbecue too. And my granny is from Huntsville, and so they would talk about the barbecue at home all the time. When I think I was probably 15, I saw the Texas barbecue episode of Great Chefs of the West, and between my grandparents talking about the barbecue when they were growing up back home, and that, I figured out I needed to do it. And so I started cooking briskets when I was a teenager.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. That's fun.
And
Well,
there was no, like, it wasn't like now, right? So this is like the 80s.
Yeah.
So it's like, there was no, like, I had to figure out how to do it on whatever equipment I had handy.
Right. There was no YouTube.
And I jury rigged a lot of stuff.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Well, boy, there's a whole separate episode on the meaning of
Well,
food.
you want me to tie this into Barfield?
What's that?
You want me to tie this into Barfield?
Yeah,
Tie
of course.
barbecue into Barfield? Okay. Actually, this is like any cooking at all. But barbecue in particular. Like, when you think about what you're doing, when you are, when you're in the kitchen or you're at the grill and you're cooking barbecue, it's not the amount of it's almost impossible. This is why when people write out recipes, it's like, I hate it when people ask me for recipes. It's like people ask me for recipes, I'll give them a recipe, and they'll come back to me and they'll say, well, it didn't turn out the way that yours did when I followed your recipe. And it's like, well, that's because it's like I can't codify like the amount of information, and the reason that I can't codify it is that writing a recipe that's Vervaeke will talk about, that's procedural knowing, right?
Yes.
Except for when you're actually in the actual act of making barbecue or making an omelet, like whatever
Right.
it is, it's not just procedural. It's not procedural. It's not propositional. It's fully embodied and participatory, which is why when you're really good at it and you've done it for a long time,
Yes.
you're going to get into a flow state when you're doing it.
That's right.
Because you're just doing it from muscle memory, because it's become just like this part of this expression of who you are, and which ties it back to poetry in the broader sense of the term poetry, right? Because poetry, and Barfield talks of, language is his focus, but there's more poetry than just the poetry of language, right? There's the poetry of doing beautiful things in a beautiful way.
Yes.
And that's in a fully embodied present way where you're having to use all of your senses. And, I mean, the old saying that, it tastes better when it's cooked with love. Well,
Right.
that's true. And it's true because of all that, because it's like the things that you can't quantify, right?
That's right.
It's not quantifiable. So that's why when I give you the recipe, that's why it doesn't turn out, because not everything about what I've done is quantifiable.
Yes. Or reducible.
Correct.
Yeah. No, I experienced that. I bake,
There you
particularly
go.
pies, and I've had a number of comments come back to me with the inability to make it taste the same way. That has to do with that liturgy, right? That repetition.
There are people who approach it as a science, but there are also people who do not approach it as a science and just learned it by doing it. And where all that stuff that the people that are doing it scientifically,
Yeah.
they're actually making it hard on themselves. It's like there are lots of people who just learned it from their grandmother, or have just been doing it for a long time, that can probably do it better.
I agree. I agree. I agree. And well, I think of it with respect to sports because I spent so much time playing basketball, and there are it is that moment that you described, the flow state, that's only possible when you no longer have to mentally concentrate on the movements
Let
required.
me ask you this, Derek. As somebody who played
Yeah.
a lot of basketball, and I used to have a decent shot once upon a time. I don't play basketball regularly with that, but I used to be a good enough shooter to know this, and I'm sure you could probably identify this one too. It's like from the way the shot felt without looking at the rim whether that shot's going in or not.
That's right. Yeah. As soon as you release it, you can.
Yep,
you'll
it's
holler,
going in. Yeah,
yeah.
exactly.
Short, long, off, or
You
in.
just
Yeah.
feel it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's fun.
yeah.
Okay, as we do turn for home, I really appreciate this, Nate. This has been a pleasure getting to know you a little better and hearing your thoughts. One of the things I'm always curious about is contemporary souls who might be either more accessible or at least write in a manner that is contemporary for people interested in Barfield's ideas or carrying on his torch.
It's McGilchrist is the big one. I would
Okay.
say it's Ian McGilchrist. His works are his latest book, Matter of Things, is it's 2 massive volumes. But he has a YouTube channel. You can consume. You'll get his general idea by watching his videos. You don't have to go and purchase the Matter of Things. And if you just want to, but what he's talking about, his primary influences are Barfield and Whitehead.
Okay.
So he's very much a Whiteheadian and a Barfieldian in his approach to things. And I think Matt Siegel is another contemporary evolution of consciousness thinker. I think his online handle is Footnotes to Plato.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
So.
I'll be sure to include that in the show.
Vervaeke. I mean, Vervaeke will tell you Barfield's wrong. He doesn't.
In what respect?
He thinks Barfield's wrong about his theory of language. John's a friend, and I love John, but I think he missed something along the way. That's one of these days I'm gonna have to hold his feet to the fire, and we're gonna have that conversation. But I haven't done it yet. But Vervaeke's big thing is participation, right?
Yeah.
And participatory knowing. And so this is Barfield. This is Barfield too. This is Barfield's big idea. And so Vervaeke's talking about the same thing. That is his big emphasis is these other ways of knowing, which is aligned with what McGilchrist's work is too, right? Because McGilchrist is saying that just gone all in on this kind of propositional knowing left-brained approach, and it's made us crazy. And we need to realize that there's more to us than that. Kind of reminds me of that T.S. Eliot has the poetic line about these are the hollow men, these are the stuffed men, right? And so that's kind of that poetic image reminds me of the way that Barfield points out that the way we look at the world, essentially it turns everything into a thing, so that we're just left with these little tiny sparks of self-consciousness that we think are located inside our skulls, and maybe, but not necessarily, and maybe in the skulls of these other humans. But really, their world it's primarily dead. It's primarily dead. And so the idea, what Barfield wants us to do is to pay attention to what he calls the inside of the world. Consciousnesses and subconsciousnesses are the inside of the world. There's Douglas Harding, the English mystic. His book Hierarchy of Heaven and Earth, I think, actually aligns a lot with Barfield. He's earlier. He's not really contemporary. He's past too. He also, like Barfield, he lived a really long time.
He did.
He did. Yeah, Harding lived into his late 90s too. But Harding, in his book Hierarchy of Heaven and Earth, he talks about how everything has an inside and an outside. Like this is begin to see the inside of things again, instead of like just being focused on the surface exterior. I think that's kind of like, even like if you look really close, like Bernardo Kastrup has a very hyper left brain way of expressing himself. But when he talks about the way that we're just kind of like looking at the control panel, like that's what that intuition is too. So there's a lot of people that see bits of it. But if I were to recommend one contemporary thinker to read as a gateway to Barfield, it would be McGilchrist.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. And yeah, you mentioned Barfield's longevity. I think he outlived Lewis by something like 35 years.
Yeah, he lived to be 98.
Yeah.
I think, it's funny. I don't know. Almost everybody I know who's a dancer lives an obscenely long time. And Barfield was an avid dancer. He loved to dance. Barfield was a dancer. So
very
I think that's the secret to longevity, is being a dancer.
Does my Pilates count as dance?
One of my best friends in high school. His dad was a Pentecostal. Dad ended up pastoring a Pentecostal church that I attended later in life. But his mom lived I think to be 100. She was a dance instructor. So it's just like,
there you go.
Yeah.
Well, that'll be the key takeaway for everyone. Go out and dance.
It's embodied movement, man. That's
right.
That is a way of knowing.
Yes.
That's the thing. It's like, it's also a way of knowing.
No, you're right.
So, yeah.
Very fun.
Yeah.
Well, Nate, I'm at the end. Any final thoughts on Barfield, and then maybe just a little bit more on what you're doing at Grail Country lately?
Yeah, I don't know if I think I pretty much said the major takeaways from Barfield. I know I can say this: that Barfield will continue to be one of the shining lights that guides Grail Country going forward. There's some things I do have coming up. I'm planning a conversation with my friend Sam Tiedemann from the Transfigured podcast and Kale Zeldin from the Underneath podcast. We're going to have a conversation about liberalism and post-liberalism. And it should be an interesting conversation because none of us are really committed. None of us is a committed liberal or a committed post-liberal. And all of us have some degree of hesitancy about post-liberalism and have some reservations in that direction. But yet at the same time, we all see the problems with liberalism and that the post-liberals are reacting to. So we're going to try and have a nuanced, grown-up conversation about that. Esther Meek said she would come on and talk to me, but I want to finish her newest book first. So I got to finish her newest book, and then I'm going to have Esther on. Esther, that is particularly for Christians. So she's actually drawing from Polanyi, but Polanyi has a lot of intuitions that Barfield thought well of Polanyi. He thought Polanyi still had some unresolved positivism, but he thought highly of Polanyi as a thinker. And so what's great about Esther Meek is that she's really good at getting people out of the knowledge as information paradigm.
Sure.
And if you can, once you've gotten past that knowledge as information paradigm,
right.
And particularly and she does it from a unambiguously Christian perspective, then I think that prepares you for the bomb that Barfield's going to drop on you. So yeah,
that's
Esther,
great.
read
So
Esther. She's very
Esther
approachable.
Meek?
She's very approachable.
And she's you said Esther Meek?
Yeah, Esther Lightcap Meek. Yeah.
Yeah.
She's just she looks like this little old church lady granny, and she talks kind of like that, but she's just full of wisdom and a brilliant philosopher and wonderful lady.
Well, how fun.
Yeah.
I forgot one other thing I was curious about if you wanted to share. What is the estuary?
Okay, so estuary is that's a thing that Paul Vanderklay started that I've been involved with since the beginning.
Okay.
I actually I lead a local estuary group here in Olympia where I'm at. And we meet every 2 weeks. We meet on Tuesday evenings from 6:30 to 8:30 p.m. in the basement of my church, which is Christ Our Hope Anglican Church in Olympia, Washington. And there are estuaries in many places throughout the country. And what estuary is it's a place where people can come together and they can talk about things in a way that they may not be comfortable. There are things that you might want to share with other adults that you might not feel comfortable talking to your pastor about, or something like that. Or like if you have you're having doubts, it's open to people, and it's like we have it in a church, but it's open. It's explicitly open to anyone from any background, religious background, not religious background. Like we have a mixture of agnostics, Christians, Jewish people. We have one Noahide who's like someone who's in the process of considering converting to Judaism, and just you talk about the things that are going on for you, whether it's like what you're struggling with intellectually or your personal life, or we just like whatever you really want to talk about. And there's a conversation protocol that we follow that is really good at getting people to engage in active listening. So we do two passes around the room, and the first time we go around the room, everyone has a chance to put something out on the table, or they can pass if they don't have anything in particular they want to talk about. And then we go around the second time, and the second time we ask you like, what are the things that you've heard brought up? Do you want to talk about more in more depth, in more detail? And you can't pass in that round. So that means that you had to have been listening, because you're going to have to put somebody else's idea on the table that wasn't your own. And so
clever.
It really, it's actually really, it's not very complicated, but it really does work, and it leads to great conversations. And what ends up getting talked about is like, different people do it slightly differently. I think Paul actually counts votes for his, Paul Vanderklay, that is. He actually counts votes. I kind of just, usually something emerges spontaneously where I don't have to count votes. People will, because once you start going around the second time, you can allow for a little crosstalk and things like that, and then a conversation kind of emerges. I think conversation is important. I think conversation is very important, and I don't think, and I mean conversation. Can I read you a little quote about conversation really quick?
Of course.
Okay, because I love this. This is actually from Meditations on the Tarot. Here we go. All right, here we go. This is Tomberg. This is from Meditations on the Tarot. He says, "Now it is through the fusion of opinions that truth lights up. Conversation, the process of together-versing, flowing together, is the very opposite of controversy. The process of controversing, flowing against. Conversation is the operation of the fusion of opinions. It is a work of synthesis. True conversation always has in principle the underlying statement from the gospel, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I in the midst of them." So
that's beautiful.
Yeah, so don't underestimate the importance of conversation, as long as it's really a conversation.
Yes.
And not a controversy or a debate.
That's right. Well, here's to more conversation, and thank you for being willing to jump on here with me today. Really appreciate your time.
Good to get a chance to talk to you. Thank you for having me.
Today's episode of The Plunge is sponsored by the word literacy. Literacy. Literacy is the ability to read and write. It is origins are English from the 19th century. Literate. It's interesting because literacy is very commonplace today. In fact, you might spend an entire year or maybe your entire life, depending on how widely you travel, and never meet a person who cannot at least read at a basic level and write at a basic, and never meet a person who can read and write at a basic level. And yet, throughout history, and around the world, literacy is a relatively new phenomenon. In fact, according to the Wiki Commons, world illiteracy was cut in half between 1970 and 2015. In 1970, it was estimated that global illiteracy was nearly 38% of the population. And as it stands today, it is approaching 10%. It's a remarkable transformation in culture and society. By helping others develop the ability to read the works of their contemporaries and those throughout the ages, we have ignited a knowledge tsunami. And that might have its downside, but there's no denying that the ability for people to read and write has become a foundational human right, and one that I am grateful to have been born in an age in which literacy is widespread. So, in tribute to the great books, in tribute to many more to come, I am grateful to literacy for sponsoring today's episode of The Plunge.